So I'm Marita Rivero, and I'm the director of the Museum of African American History. We have one site on Beacon Hill and this wonderful site on Nantucket. Five Corners, as many of you know, was originally the black community here, called New Guinea, as it often was in other cities as well. This is a part of a larger piece of property owned by a black man, Seneca Boston. And he and his wife, Thankful Micah, were both really leaders in this community in a variety of ways, but one of which was in seeing that the community needed a place to gather. And so he deeded part of his property to create what was called all over the country African meeting houses. And these were places that were used for worship, they were used for cultural evenings, they were used for committee meetings, they were used for political gathering. And certainly during this time of abolition, there was heightened interest among the black community, certainly, and the white community, and other communities of color about the issue of abolition. So we're delighted to have a person here who can speak to us really about the critical and central role of these abolition struggles in defining what would become any number of human rights struggles in the United States. Before we go to Manisha, to Professor Singha, I wanted to say a bit about the Spriggs lecture. And we've asked Neville Richen to say a word about Frank and Betty Spriggs. We've had a series of wonderful site managers on Nantucket. They were just tremendous to us. And Neville, who came from New York and has lived on Nantucket now for 30 years, was an administrator of the CPC, the Community Preservation Committee, and he knew Frank Spriggs. They worked together. Frank was, I think, was a member of the CPC. So we asked Neville whether he'd come and say a few words about why this is called the Spriggs Lecture, and I'll be back later. We're really using this microphone to talk to Nantucket Community Television, not to be amplified.
Oh, okay. So I must speak into it. Good evening, everybody. My name is Neville Richen, and I was surprised when they asked me to come and speak about Frank and Betty. What I would like to say to you about Frank and Betty is not what a lot of people in the community who know Frank and Betty and their work in the community, what they know, just what I know about Frank and Betty, some little things. I know in the space here, there were a lot of volunteers who went through these doors. He would come just to keep the place open when we were getting started. And Frank and Betty shared their times here as well. And I believe it was shortly after they gave up that spot that they started this lecture series, bringing food for thought to the community. But I decided what I was going to do is just tell you a couple of things. I'm not going to be long about Frank and Betty. I'll start with Betty. Very unusual lady. You can, I think it's been said in the past, when Frank became selectman, I used to like watching it on TV because you'll always see Betty there in the back knitting or doing something, just right there. Wherever he was, she was. And wherever she was, he was. That's how they were. They were like that. It's very unusual when we have these series, for those of you who've been here before, to have this kind of discussion before the meeting or before the series began. It was just introducing the author, and Frank and Betty will be sitting over there just quietly. And I think they kind of liked it that way. So just a little anecdote. Once I was things that happens in our communities. I was working one time. I was working at the airport, and they called me out, and I got a call from Betty, and they said Betty Spriggs is on the phone. Come on in the office. So I went on in. I said, "Hey, how you?" And Betty said, "Like, what are you doing, Neville?" I said, "I'm working." She said, "Well, can I see you?" I said, "Well, I'm working." She said, "Well, can I see you?" So I said, "Is it important?" She said, "Yeah, it's important." So I left work, and I met her. She had me meet her at the school. It's very unusual. This is just an average, everyday thing. And we got to the school. She was sitting in a car waiting for me. And I went in the car, and she explained to me what was happening. I believe the superintendent had called her, and they were having trouble with one of the kids in the school. They didn't know what to do, and they called Betty. What she informed me at that time was that this is something that was done quite often, that she was doing, quietly doing. And she said it's not something for the community to know about or anything like that. I was very impressed. She wanted me to come in and help her with this particular student, it just so happened that I knew the student. And, and in talking to the student, I just wanted to see how she did this and what she did. This type of intervention. And the way she carried herself with this student who was really quite angry, wanted to know, did you have breakfast this morning? Things like that, until the student opened up. I asked her, does this happen often? She said it happens often enough, but she's glad that they asked her to come. I said, how did they get to you to do that? She said, well, I believe it was the superintendent at that time. Just came and asked her, she would mind doing that, because sometimes they need that type of thing. So he must have seen that type of thing in this lady here, Betty Spriggs. I saw it in her. It made sense to me. With Frank, I served with Frank in the early days of the CPC in the beginning, and also on the Park and Rec. And also when he was Board of Selectmen, he helped us out a lot. That was in the beginning of a lot of activities here, in the beginning of the restoration of this campus here, which was hard. It was not easy. Everything that happens on Nantucket, it's not easy. This was like, we got a lot of resistance, before we got funded to start this project, and the beginning of the POPs and a lot of other activities that take place throughout Nantucket. We had to really fight and struggle, like, Children's Beach that we have, where we have our local talent go and play. There are a lot of local things that happen here that they were involved in very quietly. They decided to retire and come to Nantucket to spend their lives, and as far as anybody knows, they just went to the grocery store, did their eating, did their thing, and went home. And if you were lucky enough to be invited to their house to meet their beautiful daughters and grandchildren and stuff, you were very lucky to see how wide their life is and how open their life is. Other than that, you just saw them as a quiet couple. I have had I'll walk through the Stop and Shop and people will say, "Hi, Frank, how are you?" They still do it. Strangely enough, one time someone said, "Hey, Frank," and I turned around and it was Frank. Call me Frank. Because the same thing was happening with him. These were two wonderful people. These are my friends and a lot of our friends here. And thank you very much for this opportunity to allow me to share this little bits and pieces with this couple. I know this gives them a great joy, and this makes sense, this type of thing that they would do, their legacy, as I would like to call it. This is their legacy and to the community. And I think people have been enjoying it in the past, and I know you're going to enjoy it today and for years to come. Thank you very much.
So happy you did this. So I'll turn from the present day to abolition, the abolition of slavery. Only the truth is these themes are very much with us now. This is the reason that we try to connect history with what is going on today. It helps us put what we're doing in context and perhaps opens us to new ways of thinking. This book, A Slave's Cause, has one of the most glowing New York Times reviews I've read in a long time. Came out in 2016. I recommend it to you as a reading once you hear Professor Sinha. And I'm going to say, without further ado, let me bring him up here.
I guess I should thank everyone here who brought me to this place. It's been wonderful. Thank you, Marita and Charity, for arranging this visit. I really enjoyed my time here, and I look forward to speaking to you today. And it was really nice to hear about the couple that has made this lecture possible, the annual Spriggs lecture. I think it is so important for academics to speak to broader public audiences and bring their work to the community, and that does not happen often. But thanks to the Museum of African American History and other such museums, that's changing now. So I'm really, really happy to be here to speak about my book. So I've been given 45 minutes to speak, and I'm hoping we will have some time for question and answers. So I'll try to be brief. The book that I'm talking about is a very big book, and I'm just going to encapsulate today for you some of the important interventions that I think it makes in understanding the movement to abolish slavery and some of the new ways in which we can think about this. So Charity is going to help me with clicking because we don't have a clicker, the remote. So she's going to be my remote. I'm going to telepathically convey to her when we need to go to the next slide. So the Slave's Cause, and this is of course the hardcover copy. The paperback is in. They somehow changed the colors for the paperback that's available here for sale. This book is a comprehensive new history of abolition, and it sort of reevaluates the abolition movement as a radical interracial social movement. And so I argue that far from narrowing the boundaries of freedom as merely self-ownership or legitimizing other forms of inequality besides slavery, abolition broadened the horizons of democracy and gave birth to other political passions. Now, I also argue that abolition was not restricted to wartime emancipation, that the American abolitionist movement unfolded in a 100-year drama in law, politics, literature, and on-the-ground activism. So the book extends the parameters of abolition from the classical pre-Civil War period right back to the 18th century, to the Revolutionary era, one of the reasons why it's so big. Now, a social movement perspective allows us to appreciate the longevity, continuity, and breadth of abolition, whose history is often written fractured along factional lines. Men versus women, blacks versus whites, Garrisonians versus political abolitionists, people who differed on tactics of the abolition movement. Or we know the stories of outstanding individual figures and leaders. And I did not want to write that kind of history because as I researched this book over a period of 10 years, I discovered that a movement perspective really allows us to see the abolition movement as not this bunch of crazy extremist fanatics or even as the sort of bourgeois northern white reformers. Instead, we get a real sense of the movement as a radical movement that included many figures and that ideology and tactics was shaped over a very long period. So the Slave's Cause rejects conventional historical divisions between slave resistance and anti-slavery activism. Only by writing African Americans free and enslaved out of its history can we view abolition as a white middle-class movement burdened by racial paternalism and economic conservatism. I'm glad that's not my phone. Sometimes that has actually happened. So slave resistance, I argue, rather than middle-class liberalism, lay at the heart of the American abolition movement. Slave rebellions paralleled isolated criticisms of slavery in colonial America. Pioneering Quaker abolitionists, and I think we can go to the next slide, such as Benjamin Lay, pictured on the right, John Woolman on the left, and Anthony Benezet in the middle, used instances of slave resistance and African testimony against the slave trade to argue against slavery. Now, Quakers, of course, it's interesting, we're here in Nantucket, they're a big presence here. Quaker abolitionism was a big presence here, of course, the Coffins and Lucretia Mott coming from here. So Quakers, of course, used their peace testimony also to argue against slavery. But if you look at people like Lay and Benazet and Woolman, one can also see the ways in which direct contact with people of African descent influenced them. Benazet ran a school for black school children. You can see that's a famous portrait, a woodcut actually, of him in the school that he ran in Philadelphia. He was a Quaker, a school teacher. Lay, when he rose, started writing against slavery, that was 1739, very early, he actually adopted a lot of what we would call direct action tactics. He stood, barefoot in the snow to draw attention to the fact that slaves were ill-clad. He smashed his wife's teacups to protest against the consumption of sugar, the first cash crop grown by slave labor. He threw pokeberry juice at the Bibles of Quakers, saying this represents the blood of slaves. And once he kidnapped a Quaker slaveholder's children to acquaint him with the grief of African parents whose children had been torn apart from them. So he was quite a radical and virtually read out of the Society of Friends. And then there was John Woolman, who is also a very interesting figure. He, of course, married his concern for the slave with other concerns. He wrote against the destruction of the environment. He wrote about animal rights. He wrote about the rights of poor. He wrote a pamphlet called A Plea for the Poor. So again, showing that right from the beginning, Quaker abolitionists were quite aware of other wrongs in their world besides slavery, and that many of them, especially Benazet, were influenced about their views of the slave trade by people of African descent. I mean, Benazet writes a lot about West Africa, and the only way that he gets all this information is his conversation with people of African descent. So the enslaved inspired the formation of the first Quaker-dominated abolition and manumission societies, as well as the first landmark cases that inaugurated emancipation in the Western world. And if we go to the next slide, you will see that this is the first abolition society that was formed in the United States, the very start of the American Revolution, in Philadelphia, Society for the Relief of Negroes, Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage. And this is kind of a fanciful 19th century depiction of that founding moment. It shows an enslaved woman, Dinah Neville, of mixed African and Indian descent. And she was being enslaved along with her 4 children. And she went to these Quaker abolitionists to help her out. And in order to help her, they formed this society. So again, showing how the longing for freedom, or the demands for freedom even, by people of African descent really spurs abolitionist organization right from the start. One could also argue that behind every significant Anglo-American anti-slavery judicial decision lay enslaved litigants, right from the famous Somerset case in 1772, which established, quote, the freedom principle in Britain, and was widely viewed as having abolished slavery. So if we go to the next slide, you will see the abolitionist Granville Sharp. He argued the case of James Somerset, a runaway slave from Virginia who went through Massachusetts to Britain, and recruited Sharp for his freedom suit against his master. Lord Mansfield, in that decision, said that no one could take their slaves outside of Britain forcefully. Excuse me. Now, this did not mean that slavery was established in Britain, abolished in Britain, but was viewed by many people as having abolished slavery, including by the enslaved who invoked what they call the Somerset Principle to challenge slaveholding, not just in England, but also New England. Now, I think it is only appropriate, we don't have a picture of James Somerset, but I think it is only appropriate that the most significant abolitionist decision of the 18th century bears the name of a slave, James Somerset. And Northern anti-slavery lawyers and politicians would use the Somerset Principle to argue for freedom of slaves being brought into transit by Southern slaveholders to the North. So it had a long-lasting impact in Anglo-American jurisprudence. Now, in the United States, if we go to the next slide, the Quogue Walker and Mumbet cases abolished slavery in Massachusetts as part of Northern emancipation in the new American Republic. And Mumbet is pictured here in the top left. And my students in Massachusetts were always amazed when I told them that slavery was abolished in Massachusetts, not because of some law, but because two ordinary slaves actually sued for their freedom. And Mumbet was one of them. We also know that this tradition of suing for one's freedom continued right down until the famous 1857 Dred Scott decision that, of course, made Abraham Lincoln issue one of his most memorable indictments of slavery. So the actions of slave rebels and runaways, black writers and community leaders did not lay outside of, but shaped abolition and its goals. So Olaudah Equiano, who's pictured there on the right, excuse me, I picked up a really bad cold after a book tour in Australia where it was winter. And so excuse me if I cough a little bit. But Olaudah Equiano was an important figure in the Anglo-American movement to abolish the African slave trade in the 18th century. And he, of course, is known for his famous slave narrative in which he documented the abuses of the Middle Passage between Africa and the United States, in the Americas. We know, of course, that there are some scholars who challenge the veracity of his narrative, but I, for the most part, have taken part in that debate and believe that what he said was accurate. If you want to know more about that controversy, it's in the book. We also know that there were, of course, other writers, besides Equiano, who were important in the rise of abolition. One of them was Phillis Wheatley, also, of course, from Boston, Massachusetts. Wheatley, whose poems were published in London in 1773, was not just one of the first black women to be published. She's one of the first American women to be ever published. And anti-slavery women, both in Britain and the United States, especially those who wrote poetry, would evoke Wheatley and her poems for a long time. In fact, Garrison published her poetry long after she was dead. So people like, oh, that's much appreciated, a bottle of water. So people like Equiano, who took part in the movement to abolish the African slave trade in the 18th century, were of course part of a broader movement that was led by figures like Thomas Clarkson and William Wilberforce. And you can see in the next slide, there's Clarkson on the right and William Wilberforce on the left. We normally hear of them. We do not hear a lot about people like Equiano, etc., who were part of this broader movement. It took an independent scholar, an independent writer, to bring attention to these black figures. And besides Equiano, I found there were many, many more. Toba Kugano, a whole bunch of them who formed themselves into societies, Sons of Africa, etc., modeled most likely after the Sons of Liberty, and petitioned the Queen against the slave trade. So here we have an activist black sensibility right from the start, right from the 18th century in the abolition movement. Now, Clarkson, of course, is also known for having defended the Haitian Revolution, which began as a slave rebellion. And the Haitians named one of their man-of-wars after Wilberforce. So if we go to the next slide, you will see that really we can think of the Haitian Revolution that took place between 1791 to 1804, began as a slave rebellion, ended up in the formation of the first modern black republic in the New World as a truly abolitionist revolution. It resulted in the abolition of slavery, and despite Haiti's bloody and subsequently, subsequent poverty and political instability, the Haitian Revolution was really revered by abolitionists all over as an abolitionist revolution, much more so than the American Revolution, which had resulted, of course, in emancipation in the northern states, but with the continuation and, in fact, the expansion of slavery in the southern states. And the fact that the Haitians would choose to name one of their man-of-wars after Wilberforce, or the fact that they were in contact with Clarkson and other French abolitionists, reveals that they saw themselves as part of this broader movement. Now, the first call for immediate abolition, if we go to the next slide, by British Quaker abolitionist Elizabeth Hayrick, that is her silhouette from her famous pamphlet, Immediate, Not Gradual Emancipation. She published that pamphlet in 1824, and it's interesting, people wondered, where did she get this inspiration to call, to have a radical call for immediate abolition? Because most abolitionists at that time, including northern emancipation laws, tended to be very gradualist. They didn't free slaves, they freed children of slaves after they reached a certain age, etc. Except for Vermont, Massachusetts, and to a certain extent New Hampshire, most northern states passed gradual laws. Now, Hayrick called for immediate abolition. And many historians had pointed to her pamphlet as the first known call for immediate abolition. But I read towards the end of her pamphlet, she has a strong defense of the Demerara slave rebellion that had taken place a year ago. So again, showing how slave resistance in many instances radicalized abolitionists, moved them and pushed them to take more radical stances when it came to the movement to end slavery. Now, in Hayrick's participation, as Phyllis Wheatley's poems reveal, that women, who were of course disfranchised at this time too, were a very important part of the movement. Now, in the 1820s, you also had free blacks, both in Britain and the United States, calling for or issuing more militant calls for immediate abolition. One of them was a man by the name of David Walker. He ran a used clothing store in Boston. He's one of our very beloved, famous figures in the Museum of African American History, a black Bostonian who actually was born in North Carolina, a free black man, and migrated to Boston, going through South Carolina where the Denmark-Vesey slave conspiracy had taken place. So again, revealing the influence of slave rebellion in radicalizing the thoughts, not just of white abolitionists, but also black abolitionists like David Walker, who issued his famous sort of pamphlet, an appeal on behalf of the colored citizens of the world. Now, as most abolitionists understood, the story of abolition must begin with the struggles of the enslaved. In both Britain and the United States, slave rebellion acted as an impetus for the second wave of abolition in the 19th century. Excuse me. So if we go to the next slide, you will see that in 1831, we have two very important major slave revolts taking place that push forth Anglo-American abolition. One was a rebellion in Jamaica led by Samuel Daddy Sharp on the right. This famous rebellion was very cruelly suppressed, and it led to an outcry in Britain at the cruelty displayed by colonial authorities. What is more important, of course, is that in 1832, then, Britain formed a committee to facilitate the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. Now, many other factors played a role, including abolitionist petitioning, mass petitioning, women's involvement. You had the Great Reform Act, which liberalized voting in Britain also at this time. It's always good to have more people vote rather than less. All these factors led to abolition, but clearly Sharp's rebellion was the catalyst that led to abolition in the British Empire. The second important revolt was, of course, the bloodiest slave revolt in U.S. history, Nat Turner's rebellion. And this is a contemporary illustration of Nat Turner being discovered in the woods in Virginia after his rebellion has been suppressed. What's more important, of course, for me, was to see that this was the first time that the Virginia General Assembly actually debated a bill on abolition. Right? So maybe Nat Turner's rebellion failed, but the fact is that his rebellion proved to be the impetus of reopening the abolition question in a southern state, where in fact abolition had failed during the Revolutionary era. Now in Virginia, they didn't succeed this time either. They lost narrowly, but they still lost. But the fact remains that the political significance of Nat Turner's rebellion is important to note. So this notion that somehow slave rebellions were just these bloody, manic affairs and venting of rage by the enslaved should give way to a more politically sophisticated understanding of what slave rebels wanted and what they wanted to achieve. And it's quite clear from some of Nat Turner's confessions, even though they were written by a white Virginian lawyer, that he had slavery in his sights when he began his rebellion. So now the connection between slave resistance and abolition in the United States was proximate and continuous. It gave abolition its most enduring issue, the fugitive slave controversy, and provided the movement with its most dynamic exponents, fugitive slave abolitionists. And if we go to the next slide, you will see this is a picture of a runaway slave, or rather an illustration of a runaway slave that graced American newspapers right from the colonial era down to the Civil War, where you would advertise basically a runaway slave. And many times these advertisements contained descriptions of slaves with marks on their bodies, with ears cut off, etc., marks of brutality on their body, so that one American abolitionist, Theodore Well, literally just republished all these Southern slave advertisements for runaway slaves as an indictment of slavery. Called his book American Slavery as It Is, and it was the best-selling book on slavery before Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, even after bitter division sundered the movement, nothing brought all abolitionists together more readily than the fugitive slaves' desperate bid for freedom. And here's where I think we need to understand the history of the Underground Railroad in the North, not as myth and fiction, but as the real sort of development of what I call the abolitionist underground, where blacks and whites were assisting fugitive slaves right from the start. And many times they brought different abolitionists together. Blacks and whites, Garrisonians and political abolitionists. They may differ on many other issues, but when it came to helping out a desperate fugitive slave, the abolitionist network always kicked into high gear, including contacting anti-slavery lawyers and politicians and keeping all their options open. So fugitive slaves also influenced the ideology of the movement, leading some abolitionists and radical anti-slavery politicians in the North to justify revolutionary resistance to slavery. To leave the enslaved out of the abolition movement, then, is to profoundly miss the part that African Americans have played in shaping the protest traditions of abolition and American democratic radicalism. Slave resistance revolutionized abolitionist discourse and practice and moved abolition into northern state and courthouses. And there were many such landmark historic cases over fugitive slaves, some that went right up to the United States Supreme Court that were issued at this time. And I won't describe them all in detail, otherwise you'd be here the entire night. It's all in the book. The personal liberty laws and attempts to grant fugitives trial by jury and prevent the kidnapping of free blacks, as you may have seen in the famous movie 12 Years a Slave, challenged the extraterritoriality of Southern slave codes mandated by the fugitive slave laws. So the fugitive slave controversy did create a huge sectional conflict between the North and South. And we can see when we move as we move to the Civil War, that the controversy over slavery was not just restricted to the expansion of slavery to the territories, which is the way it is normally portrayed, but that the fugitive slave controversy, right from the founding of the Republic, was an extremely important irritant in sexual relations. So if you go to the next slide, you will see another important result of the fugitive slave controversy. It created fugitive slave abolitionists. The most famous, of course, was Frederick Douglass, pictured here in the middle. I hear he's doing an amazing job. But he's been long dead, however. And then, of course, Harriet Tubman, who became a participant in the Underground Railroad herself, rescuing many, besides her family members, from slavery. She was supposed to replace Andrew Jackson in the $20 bill, but I have a feeling that's not going to happen. And then there was Jermaine Lagoon from Syracuse, also a fugitive slave, who famously said, "The fugitive slave law outlaws me, and therefore I will outlaw it." And There was a fugitive by the name of Henry Bibb who published a newspaper from Canada where a lot of fugitive slaves went to escape the federal fugitive slave laws of the United States. It was called The Voice of the Fugitive. William Wells Brown, who went on to England, he's at the bottom right, was a famous writer and took on Thomas Carlyle for his views on race. Harriet Jacobs, pictured here at the bottom, she wrote the first iconic female slave narrative, and Samuel Ringgold Ward, who eventually migrated to Jamaica and fought for abolition. So what the fugitive slave controversy also gave the abolition movement were these outstanding abolitionist figures who lectured not just within the United States but also abroad, in Europe, in England, gaining acclaim, fighting against slavery and slaveholders. And in a way, they had an authenticity that sometimes other abolitionists could not muster. Slaveholders were quick to dismiss Northern abolitionists as having no idea about what slavery was really like. We were really kind to our slaves. We took care of them. We fed them. Northern workers were treated worse than slaves. This was the standard rhetoric of the pro-slavery argument. The fugitive slaves were very effective, especially a superb orator like Douglas, who of course began his career right here in Nantucket as an anti-slavery speaker, because they could speak from personal experience. They were the best riposte to this notion of slavery being a wonderful, benevolent institution, because they could actually document the atrocities that they and their families and communities had been subject to. So if you look at the fugitive slave controversy and its contributions to the abolition movement, we will see that you can see slaves playing a very important part in the controversy and in the movement itself. And this sort of comes to a head in the 1850s after the passage of the new federal fugitive slave law of 1850. If we go to the next slide, you will see what I call the famous fugitive slave rebellions of the 1850s. And these took place all over the North, in big cities like Boston and Philadelphia, but also in smaller places, all over in Oberlin, Ohio, where they had a famous rescue of John Price, an enslaved man who was being hidden by Oberlin abolitionists. Of course, you know that Oberlin began as a college founded by abolitionists open to women and blacks. The famous Anthony Burns case, he's pictured in the middle in Boston, which made President Fillmore send in federal troops to Boston to enforce the fugitive slave law and remand Burns back to his owner. The more famous Joshua Glover case, in the top right, in Wisconsin, in Racine, Wisconsin, this case was important because it led the state of Wisconsin to nullify the federal fugitive slave law, basically. They said that they would not implement the fugitive slave law. It was a case involving some of the defenders of Joshua Glover. And the Christiana riot in Pennsylvania, in the bottom, where, in fact, fugitive slaves and their allies killed a slaveholder in self-defense. He was coming with federal marshals to remand his slaves back to slavery. So if we go to the next slide, I would like to argue that John Brown was not an aberration, as he's commonly portrayed to be, but a result of this growing militancy and radicalization of the American abolition movement on the eve of the Civil War. Brown, of course, wanted to raid the South and begin a slave rebellion that would end slavery. And he was inspired by people like Nat Turner, by the Maroons in Jamaica, and the Haitian Revolution. Now, enslaved freedom seekers had contributed to the breakdown of comity between southern and northern states, a dress rehearsal for their momentous actions during the Civil War, when they helped initiate the emancipation process by voting with their feet and defecting to Union Army lines. So throughout the antebellum period, fugitive slaves had been seeking free spaces, whether it was Indian Territory, sometimes Mexico, even stowing away in ships all the way to England. When the Civil War began, the free territory that they found were lands occupied by the Union Army, and they defected into Union Army lines in such large numbers that they forced the Lincoln administration to take a position on slavery. You know, what should the Army do? Should they return them to treasonous slaveholders or declare them free? So the history of abolition is an integrated story, even though it is usually not told in that manner. Sometimes the insidious divide between white thought and black activism that pervades some books is both racialist and inaccurate. There was no such racial division of political labor in the abolition movement. Early African American literature, a lot of it written by fugitive slaves themselves, their slave narratives, like Douglas's slave narrative, which was a bestseller in its day. Black abolitionists' intellectual response to the pseudoscience of race. There was one black abolitionist by the name of James W.C. Pennington who wrote a response to scientific racism in the 19th century. And he was given an honorary doctorate by the University of Heidelberg, which in its 625th anniversary actually invited me to talk about Pennington, because not many people had heard about this guy. And they endowed a Pennington Fellowship, and President Obama sent his greetings, saying that, Pennington's story is a lot like mine. He came out of nowhere and sort of made something of himself. So it was quite a moment at that time. So the theoretical sophistication of black abolitionist thought should finally put to rest the influential yet glib view that they were just sort of middle class and that they were elitist and that they were divorced from the plight of Southern slaves. In fact, most of them were fugitive slaves. The black and white abolitionists, they appealed to the American Republican tradition, but they were also staunch critics of the Republican tradition, of its failure to deal effectively with questions of slavery and race. Now, if we go to the next slide, you will see that Harriet Beecher Stowe, when she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin and it became this international bestseller, what is often forgotten is that she based her novel on many of these slave narratives that she had read. And when Southerners accused her of making up her stories, she actually published a key to Uncle Tom's Cabin in which she listed the slave narratives and passages from it that had influenced her while she was writing her book. And she herself was not an abolitionist initially. She was a colonizationist. She believed that free black people should be sent back to Africa, and her book is suffused with romantic racialism in her sort of descriptions of Uncle Tom. But the reaction to her book made her steadily grow more radical and come closer to people like Douglass and Garrison. And if we go to the next slide, so the alternative nature of abolitionism is showcased by its diverse membership, which gave rise to cooperation as well as creative conflict along rigid lines of race, class, and gender that characterize early American society. The abolition movement was driven by passionate outsiders, in which the disfranchised, including women, played a seminal role. And these are some of the most famous abolitionist women that you may have heard of. Lydia Maria Child on the top right, who wrote the famous An Appeal on Behalf of That Class of Americans Whom We Call Africans. It's one of the first pamphlets against racism. The Grimke sisters, who spoke out in public against slavery, following a black abolitionist woman, Maria Stewart, in Boston, a sort of comrade of David Walker's. Lucretia Mott, very important for Nantucket. There's also a road named after her. I was so thrilled when I saw that. She, of course, was there not just at the founding of the American Anti-Slavery Society, but also the founding of the first National Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls. Then, of course, Sojourner Truth, who spoke both for abolition and feminism. She was a slave in the state of New York, who then became a very important part of the movement. Abby Kelly, whose election to the executive committee of the Anti-Slavery Society resulted in a split in the abolition movement between those who supported and those who were against women's rights. And of course, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, the top right, one of my favorite forgotten abolitionists. She was a black woman, an extremely effective orator and writer who's been relatively forgotten. So women were abolition's foot soldiers, and more controversially, its leaders and orators. In birthing the first women's rights movement, abolition again revealed its radical face. Now, during Reconstruction after the Civil War, the abolitionist feminist alliance faltered. And while the women's movement became more autonomous, it also lost the abolitionist commitment to racial equality. As I write in the book, some things were gained, but a lot was lost for the American women's movement. And in a way, we really need to think of some of these pioneering black and white abolitionist movement who had always linked those two causes in their activism. So never the so-called monomaniacs, they were lampooned as abolitionists, starting with the early Quakers, recognized that the oppression of slaves was linked to other wrongs in their world. More than a few abolitionists joined such international radical movements such as feminism, utopian socialism, and pacifism, the first international peace movement, and championed Native American, immigrant, and working men's rights. Now, if you go to the next slide, William Lloyd Garrison, credited as the founder of the abolition movement, not only adopted African Americans' critique of colonization. This was his plan to send all free blacks back to Africa. Black abolitionists rejected that and demanded black citizenship and equality in the United States. They were foreseeing an interracial democracy right from the start. So Garrison adopted their platform. He rejected colonization. He says, I'm an abolitionist not just because I want to end slavery, but also because I'm fighting for black rights and equal citizenship rights in this country. And this, of course, is one of my favorite illustrations of Garrison because it was done by a black abolitionist artist, Robert Douglas Jr. in Philadelphia. And he, of course, published his famous newspaper, The Liberator, in Boston from 1831, 1865. Until today, that is a great resource for African-American life in Boston because he published so many black writers and so much of what was happening in the black community. Now, Garrison was somewhat of a radical in every sense of the word. He supported the labor movement's 8-hour-a-day movement. He formed an alliance with British Chartists, which was a British labor movement. And he even anticipated some contemporary American scourges, criticizing the criminalization of blackness and the use of capital punishment and force by the state. In fact, the last man to be executed by the state of Massachusetts was a black man in the 1840s, and Garrison immediately pointed that out. He also once quipped that all American institutions had shut their doors to black people except what he called, quote, the prison houses. So the abolition, if you go to the next slide, you will see this is the motto of Garrison's paper, "Our country is the world, our countrymen all mankind." And it sort of reflects his wide-ranging radicalism. Abolition was then a radical democratic movement that questioned the enslavement of labor. As radical agitators, abolitionists were not so much theorists of liberal democracy, but critics of it. In prioritizing the abolition of slavery, they did not ignore and certainly did not defend other forms of oppression in the modern world. They were, in a way, intellectual and political precursors of 20th century anti-colonial and civil rights activists. Debating the nature of society and politics, the relationship between racial inequality and democracy, nation and empire, labor and capital, gender and citizenship. They used the vehicle of anti-slavery to criticize the democratic pretensions of Western societies and to expose their seamier side. Now, I know I had quite a bit left here, but I don't want to keep you here too long, and I want to stick to the time. I think we are supposed to be done at 4 o'clock with this, excuse me, talk. So I will end with saying that abolitionists were original and critical thinkers on democracy, not simply romantic religious reformers who confined themselves to appeals to the heart. The movement against slavery made a signal contribution to the discourse of both human rights, humanitarianism, and the law. Abolitionists, for the most part, challenged rather than shored up the status quo. From women's rights, the abolition of capital punishment, the peace movement, immigrant and working men's rights, to the rights of native populations trampled by European settlers and imperialism, abolitionists linked the slaves' cause with a variety of other causes. And I could not talk on many of these other causes that the abolitionists espoused, but they immediately linked their cause, for instance, with the 1848 European revolutions for national self-government and republicanism. They linked their cause with the Chartist movement. They linked their cause with the Irish Repeal, in fact, used with repeal from the British Union, that is, and used that, in fact, to appeal to Irish immigrants in the United States. Unfortunately, they were not that successful in that instance. They used appeals to Indians in India, which I found fascinating, being of Indian descent myself, that they actually criticized British rule in India and emerging schemes for imperialism in Africa. So they were rather far-sighted and rather broad-ranging in their ideas about equality. So abolitionist ideas on racial inequality are a starting point in an interracial discourse of democratic radicalism in the modern world. Their concerns relentlessly internationalist and eclectic. The struggle against slavery did not normalize or rationalize other forms of injustice, but gave birth to diverse radical passions. It was the eclipse rather than the triumph of the abolitionist moralité after the fall of Reconstruction that led to the most egregious crimes against humanity at home and abroad. Thank you for listening so patiently.
I think what I might do is just ask if there are 2 or 3 questions. We could just take them right now as a group and then let Manisha respond to them because I've got an eye on the clock. One question would be...
one thing that you, at one point, I know...
I need to let you do this so the television audience can't hear you at all.
One point that you hinted at, and I was kind of fascinated by, and I'm sure it could be we could be here a whole nother hour on this topic, but one of the things you mentioned, or one of the things I got from your lecture, is that after the anti-slavery movement, many, what we would today call progressive causes, it seems, progressivism, the beginning of progressivism, it seems that sort of dropped off after, once slavery was abolished, in some ways. It is, again, I know you could do a whole nother hour lecture on this topic, but in 2 minutes, do you have any idea why, once slavery was abolished, the work of progressivism kind of stopped in a way for a while?
Yeah.
Let me collect another question or two. Chandra, you had a question? Anyone else? So one is the progressive movement question.
Okay.
Well, actually, this is a question I was going to ask the audience about. After having heard this, what has the past taught us about freedom and enslavement, especially in terms of the present-day struggles for social justice?
Are there any more questions here? If not, I'm just going to leave it open a little bit. We just have about 7 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes.
Sure. Well, I think that's a great question because, abolition did sort of cross-fertilize with and sort of encourage other radical movements, right? Like land reform, labor, etc. I saw a lot of that happening. Previous historians had either ignored that or said, oh, these movements talk past each other. There was no meeting ground. But I saw there was a lot of cross-fertilization. So what happens after the Civil War is after the fall of Reconstruction, when to a certain extent with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, you have the implementation of abolition's goals, you really find a sort of waning of abolitionist activism, mainly because Reconstruction is overthrown, and you really do enter into a period of backlash of conservatism. And I always tell my students this, that we always think of American democracy as kind of progressive and linear and, sort of progressive and greater freedom for everyone. And that's not really the case historically. It's always moved in fits and starts, and historically it's gone backwards. So after Reconstruction, you can notice a real waning of all kinds of activism. It does not completely disappear. There are still abolitionists in the women's movement, in the labor movement, black rights. Many of them feed into the founding of the NAACP, including Garrison's grandson. Exactly. So you do have that eventually emerging. But the fall of Reconstruction was a huge setback for progressive forces and for American democracy. And in fact, I'm writing a book on Reconstruction right now. Alan?
Yeah. I just add that one of the big things... One of the large influences of the time was the white Northerners and white Southerners wanting to get back together as if somehow there had been a disruption and they were the important people and these other things could maybe take care of themselves, but the whites and blacks had to, I mean the whites, North and South,
Yeah,
had to reunite.
that was the compromise of 1877 that overthrew Reconstruction, which was basically they left the South to Southern whites. And it was a great sort of racial reunion at the backs of black people, but also at the cost of American democracy, because it led to the virtual nullification of all these Reconstruction amendments and laws that had established black citizenship in this country, black male citizenship. Yeah.
All right, I will get this last question and go to a book signing. You are going to sign some books?
Okay,
All
I'm
right.
happy to.
Yes, you do.
I know from, they can hear me.
No, not these people, the people.
That's for the TV.
Oh, the TV, okay, thank you. From PBS, I remember, I think it was a program on the history of African American people in the US. There was a time with the first African people in the United States that they were free. And then there was a moment where it suddenly transitioned, and I think, I can't remember. I want you to tell me about it. When suddenly, somewhere they decided in the South that they weren't free anymore, and these same people who had been free suddenly became not free, and their children were not free. And when was the first slave importation that happened? I'd like to ask about that. The origins of how we accepted this whole thing. Thank you.
Yeah, so, you know, slavery is not recognized in English common law, right? So that was Somerset's premise. Granville Sharp used that to fight Somerset's case in Britain. English common law does not recognize slavery, but of course the Spanish and the Portuguese had established slavery in the New World. So when the English colonists established slavery, they had to literally invent slavery and the laws of slavery and race in the American colonies. And you see this happening in Virginia most dramatically, where the first Africans come in 1619. Of course, long before that, Africans had come with the Spanish conquistadors in what was Spanish America and Florida, etc. But when the first Africans come to British North America, their status is not that of slaves. They're treated virtually like indentured servants. But you can see from between 1640 to 1660, the status of white indentured servants improves, and that of people of African descent goes down, and they are being enslaved lifetime. They are being punished more rigorously. Their rights are being taken. Race is being codified. For instance, interracial marriage is being criminalized, etc. So you can see race and slavery being made on the ground in the law. And by the 1670s, most of the colonies have slave codes that replicate the slave codes of other slaveholding societies, and this is also the time that the British dominate the African slave trade. So all that comes together, and you have the creation of racial slavery. So yes, it wasn't always there, and it is a historical construction, and I think that should give us hope that we can fight against these ideas of racism, because you can see them historically being constructed, so they can effectively be combated in law. Yeah.
What about Native Americans? I believe there were also Native American slaves. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. There were, of course, the Spanish and the Portuguese first experimented with Native American slavery. Las Casas' famous protest against Native American slavery was to say, oh, we should enslave Africans instead. And that was his solution. And then he came to regret that solution. In the US itself, Native American slavery lies hidden in plain sight. Native Americans were enslaved along with African Americans. Many communities, especially in New England, are mixed Native American, African American, and they were enslaved. Of course, the situation was a little different because Native American populations also died out through warfare and disease. And many times, Native American slaves were shipped to the Caribbean in order to prevent further warfare occurring, let's say, in New England, etc. But there are books now that are increasingly talking about forms of unfree labor and enslavement of Native Americans that persisted right up to the Civil War. And in the book, I talk a lot about the ways in which abolitionists took up the rights of Native Americans, like protesting the removal of the Cherokees, protesting the taking away of their lands, especially the Seminoles, which was a nation of runaway slaves and Native Americans in Florida that fought against the U.S. government in two huge battles. Famous anti-slavery politician Joshua Giddings wrote the history of Seminole warfare, seeing it as an instance of the U.S. government suppressing not just Native Americans, but also using that as an excuse to get back runaway slaves. So it's a long, tangled history, and you're right to raise that question. Lydia Maria Child, after the Civil War, wrote an appeal on behalf of Native Americans, modeled after her appeal on behalf of African Americans. But yes, it was an important part of it. I think the last question, you had your last question, right? I think the abolitionist legacy is really important for contemporary struggles for social justice. And I have an epilogue in the book where I talk about the continuing abolitionist legacy, or like all the people who fight today against mass incarceration, against human trafficking, and those sorts of issues, or even other forms of racial inequality, evoke the abolitionists. Their journals are called Abolition Democracy or The Abolitionists, etc. And I kept collecting instances of it as I was writing the end of the book to talk about how the abolitionist legacy is a never-ending one. So that was it. Yeah.
That's a terrific note to end on, I think.
Thank you.
And Manisha, thank you again for joining us. It's been a terrific afternoon. I'll let you move to the back and sign. Someone said, is she going to sign a book? I said, yes, she will. So thank you again.
Thank you.